Hello and welcome to section 3 of Boarding Fundamentals, the Care and Protection of Children. We need to look first of all at the child protection legislation and procedures that we work under, and in every boarding residence, of course, we have a duty of care as supervisors to respond to indicators of harm and risk to students. This topic is covered much more in detail in Unit 2 that you will come to later. But initially, let's think about how may we become aware of abuse. How do we know how can we possibly know if a young person has been abused? There's two different ways, of course. You may see indicators of abuse and then form a belief from what you're seeing or observing. Or the other way, of course, you may be told by someone, and that would be called a disclosure. And that might be the young person themselves that tells you, or somebody else like a friend or somebody. So what do we do then? How do we know how to respond to abuse? We should understand, as we go through this, and Unit 2 will come to a place where we understand how we form a reasonable belief of abuse. Then also we need to be aware of the law in our state or territory, and whether we are mandated by law to report, or if we may just report in a different way because we have an obligation to the young person and their safety. How do we report abuse and harm? What's the correct way? And what is our residence policy? We need to follow the policy as well as the law. So in each state, of course, there's a different law about mandatory reporting in every state, and a mandatory reporter is a person that must report child abuse if they're aware of it or have a belief, and that is by law. Each state is different, and only a couple of states actually include the category of boarding supervisor in the list of mandated reporters. That means you can be prosecuted if you fail to report. If you're not a mandated reporter, of course, you can still report a concern, but you just do it in a different way. So we must always follow our law first, follow our policies and procedures, and, of course, uphold our duty of care standard. Let's just have a quick look now at some of the different states' laws. In South Australia, for instance, there's a list of mandated notifiers here, and you can't really see boarding supervisors listed in there until you come to the last dot point, which says any other person in an organisation that provides health, welfare, education or residential services for children. So that would mean that boarding supervisors are in that mandated notifier list. So then the law then says they must make a report to DCP or the Child Protection Department if you suspect a young person is being abused or neglected. We don't have to be able to prove it, we just have to have reasonable grounds to report. Under this South Australian legislation, it also says quite a unique thing. It says a mandated notifier's duty of care is not over when they make the report. So we need to consider how we can continue to respond to the needs of the child and their family. So it's pretty important that we follow on and respond afterwards. In Western Australia, we have a new, fairly new section to our amendment to our law, and it came to being in 2015, and this is after the Royal Commission had investigated a lot of situations, and so we now have boarding supervisors as one of the mandated reporters listed in the Western Australian law. In the Northern Territory, under their Care and Protection of Children Act, it says a legal responsibility exists on every person in the Northern Territory to report any abuse. So there's no list in the territory, it just means every adult basically in the Northern Territory is mandated. That means you can be fined if you know about abuse and you don't report it. What about Queensland? Queensland has an unusual set of laws. It's got two laws. Firstly, the Child Protection Act. Under this act, there is a list of certain professionals that if they form a reasonable suspicion, they must report, and that's the mandatory reporters list there. Teachers, doctors, nurses, police officers, person performing a child advocate function, early childhood education and care professionals. Now, you can't see boarding supervisors listed in that list. Some people think, oh, maybe we're a person performing a child advocate function, but that's not correct. We are not listed in that list. Boarding supervisors are not listed. So under that law in Queensland, you aren't a mandatory reporter. But you have a second law in Queensland, and that is the Queensland Education General Provisions Act. And under this law, it says that you have to report to your principal or the board. Under this law, you have an obligation to report sexual abuse if you suspect it or become aware of it. You must give a written report about the abuse or suspected abuse to the school's principal or a director of the school's governing body immediately, whether you work in a state school or a non-state school. So under the first law, boarding supervisors are not mandated, but under the second law, because you work in a school, if you work in a school, whether state or private, then you are mandated. But now what about if you work in a boarding hostel that is not a school? Then you are not mandated under this law either. So boarding supervisors, say in a residence like Cowboys House or AFL House or something like that, which is not a school, then you are not actually mandated to report. Let's go on now and look at how we become aware of signs and the process of what we do. You may become aware of abuse because you've seen indicators or been told, as we said in question 1. So let's have a look at how we come to a reasonable belief then from those indicators. Firstly, we might observe an indicator or a sign and think, oh, that seems like, and there's lists of indicators for all the different types of abuse, and we'll cover that in Unit 2. But you might see an indicator, so then you document it somewhere quite secure, not in the child's normal file, but you write down what you saw and the date and the time and where you were, and then you just continue to observe. And if you notice another indicator of abuse, another sign that is in the list of signs for abuse, then you might document that one down, and at this stage you might want to start to discuss this with maybe the head of boarding or a senior staff member, just one, not everybody, because you don't want to influence other people. And at the same time, you might want to just make yourself a little bit more available to the young person without questioning them or leading them to tell you anything. You might just provide opportunity for them to talk to you. Just let them know I'm available. If I'm concerned for you, you seem, to be struggling this term or something like that, and let them know that if you want to talk to me, I'm available. And then you might end up forming a belief from those indicators or not. So that's the way you come to a reasonable belief. What about if a student discloses abuse? What do we do? How do we deal with that? We listen and believe them, never show any doubt, and show them some empathy, because it must be painful and it must have taken a lot of courage to actually disclose to you. But you must never investigate. It's not our job to try and find out more details or ask them a lot of questions. We just need to also assess if they're at any immediate risk of harm, and also then assess, do we have reasonable grounds to make a report? Yes, if they've told you something about abuse, then you've got reasonable grounds. You need to inform the student at this stage, I need to tell somebody about this because we need to get you some help and protection, and other young people as well who may be being affected. So then you let the student know what you will do. You try and get them to understand that that's the best thing for them and get their consent, but if they don't, you still have to make your report. So you would follow your policy and make your report. Now, of course, you would follow the law in your state first, and whether you're a mandated reporter or not will determine how you go about making your report and who to. So try and ensure confidentiality for the young person. Don't inform everybody in the residence or anybody else but maybe the head of boarding or the principal, but still try and provide some ongoing support for that young student in a non-obvious way, just monitoring them for any risk of harm. The next section we're going to cover is duty of care. Now, what is a duty of care? It's a legal obligation. So by law, you have an obligation to keep a standard of reasonable care when you're employed in a job that is working with other people's children. So you have to have a reasonable standard of care for the care and protection of students, to be able to foresee any risk to them or any harm and be able to manage that harm and risk. Now, you might be thinking, well, I didn't know there was a law about duty of care. There's not actually a duty of care law, but this comes under what we call common law, which is formed by different precedents and court cases. And the common law that this would come under is the law of negligence, where if a person suffers injury because of the negligence of somebody else, then they should be compensated for the loss and damage that arises out of their negligence. So if somebody was going to try and prove that they had a claim of negligence against you or against your residents, they would have to prove 4 things. They would have to prove that you did have a duty of care, that you did owe that young person a duty of care, that a reasonable standard of care was not observed, and that it was that breach of care that actually caused the injury. And then the other thing they would have to prove is that the risk to the young person was foreseeable. You know, it wasn't something that was totally unpredictable. And the likelihood of harm for whatever that thing was significant. So then what is a reasonable standard of care that maybe wasn't observed? Well, a reasonable standard of care is just that degree of care or caution or watchfulness that any other reasonable person or organisation would have provided under the circumstances. So if you're off camping or you're in the boarding house or you're down the supermarket or something like that, just whatever reasonable standard of care others would have provided. So it's like a common standard across boarding houses would be looked at. There's an example in the notes that you can read about a young boy, 15-year-old, who was seriously injured when climbing a flagpole, and the flagpole fell on him. Now this event occurred on a terrible day in this school when the school came together and they found out that the principal had died that night before, and the school was in a state of shock, of course. The teachers called a big staff meeting, and at the time they left a couple of people out in the playground supervising, but not enough for the number of students. And so these young boys climbed on the flagpole. It fell on this boy and injured him, and the court found the school negligent. Now, they said they failed to provide proper supervision, they hadn't ensured that the flagpole was padlocked, and they hadn't had a rule that the flagpole should not be used without the authority of a teacher. So the school was found negligent. Now, that means that, you know, educational institutions and staff have a high standard of care. We actually have to have a higher standard of care than the parents of the kids themselves. And part of our standard of care is to provide a safe, suitable, safe premises and program and adequate supervision, prevention of bullying, provision of good medical assistance, and well-trained and qualified staff to be able to care for young people. So when we're assessing risk, of course, the standards of care can vary greatly according to the circumstances of the young people. So, the degree of risk of harm would differ totally for if we were supervising a group of students swimming at a beach or just back in the boarding house doing their homework. So, we have to be able to assess the risk of the different types of situations we're in. There is a concept that we need to study here, and that is about dignity of risk. Now, this term means that a person has a right to choose to take some risks and even maybe fail when they're taking risks. Now, young people, of course, learn from experiencing success and failure, taking some risks. And so we're saying, the concept is saying that a person has a right to experience and learn and grow by trying a new skill or taking part in an activity that might have some element of risk in it, but there's more benefit to them by gaining the learning and the independence and the self-esteem that comes out of that skill. So it's interesting, we saw this article in a news feed recently, and it was talking about schools that are called anti-cotton wool schools because they're trying to roll back this situation and allow young people to have some kind of dignity of taking a bit of risk in their play, not trying to wrap them in cotton wool and prevent all risk-taking or a little bit of activity that might harm them. Now, of course, there is a balance we have to strike here, and question 5 asks, what is that balance? Well, we need to be able to allow a student to take some risk to learn and develop and try new things, but at the same time, we need to ensure that they are going to be safe, or the risk is not too high, the risk of injury is not too high. In saying that, the safety of the young person should always come first, of course. But in a court case in South Australia court, the judge actually said there's a fine balance between discipline and supervision and giving young people freedom of action and independence. So if there's any risk of harm in an activity, what do? Totally reject every activity that's got a tiny bit of harm? Or do we try and manage the environment, change it, and reduce the risk to an acceptable level and allow the activity to go on? That's one of the concepts we need to look at. The next one is called contributory negligence. Now, what does this mean? It means that if a person gets injured when they knowingly did something that they perhaps knew was risky or harmful, but they knowingly did it, and doing it contributed to their own harm. So the courts recognise that when a person knowingly puts themselves at risk, the people who are caring for them then have a decreased liability because they've knowingly done something that maybe they'd been warned not to do. And an example of this is in the notes where some young children in a boarding house had got the floor in the bathrooms wet, and they'd put some soap or detergent on it, and they were having a great time sliding on the wet floor. Now they were, didn't seem to appear to have much risk of harm there, but one of the young students did it while they were holding a sharp pencil in their hand, and the pencil went into their eye and they were injured. So looking at that concept of contributory negligence, how aware were they? How much did they really think and understand? Did they knowingly do this thing when the girl slid with the pencil in her hand? How much did she understand of the risk in that? Of course, children aren't adults, so they don't always have our thinking capacity. So maybe they aren't knowing enough or aware of enough of the risks, and so if we think that is the case, we do have a duty to intervene and prevent them from doing that, something that might be highly risky. Now, of course, that word knowingly, some young people, how knowingly do they do it? You know, they might be too young to understand. They might be under peer pressure. They might be having a psychotic illness or episode, or have a condition where they don't understand well enough the risk of something. So then we need to intervene. If a boarding supervisor is aware that students are going to engage in risky behaviour, then we do have a duty to intervene and ensure that they're not going to be injured. Of course, some tiny risk is something different, but the courts have found that there has been a breach of duty of care, therefore negligence, on occasions when the teacher or the supervisor has been aware of danger but didn't intervene. So if you do, we often get asked, what about students who are getting signed out for the weekend? What if we believe that they're going to a place or going to do an activity that's dangerous or very risky? Then we do need to do something about that. If we know something, then we need to do something about it. Okay, now what happens when, we hand over our duty of care, sometimes temporarily? We might refer a student to a professional outside of the boarding house, or we might hand them over to another agency or organisation that's going to run an event for the young people. So if we refer people on, what is our duty of care then? What happens about our duty of care? So question 7's asking, when we're referring students to another organisation, what should we ensure? Well, we need to check firstly, does the person or the one running the activity or whatever, do they have the right qualification to meet the student's need or to run the activity? Are they qualified in whatever they're doing? Also, are they safe to work with children? So we must know that they have a clearance to work with children, and we need to check that if we don't know that. We'll talk more about that in Unit 2. The third thing we need to check is, do we have the parent's authorisation for the young person to go to that activity or to that agency or professional? And fourthly, when we're handing over what we think is our duty of care, have we done our due diligence that that place or person is safe and that the student is going into a safe situation? So there's the 4 things that we need to ensure to check our duty of care. Now, there is a concept here called non-delegable duty of care, and this means that a duty of care, some duty of care cannot be given over to another party. So even if they are providing a service and we're taking our students to them, it doesn't remove the duty of care of us as the education or boarding residents. So what does that mean then? We can't hand over young people to other people to run activities. What about the coaches at the football club and things like that? Well, we do hand our students over, but our duty of care is not delegable. That means we can't totally hand it over. And schools have a duty of care, which is not just able to be delegated to the teacher or to the boarding supervisor alone. In some cases, the court has found that the teacher was negligent if something happened, but so was the school, because the school can't just delegate its duty of care to somebody else. So this is the concept of non-delegable duty of care. So what does that mean then? Well, we still take people and let them go to outside events and outside professionals for help, but we do need to do a risk assessment on that person or situation. Any activities they're going into that could provide a risk or a hazard, they need to be assessed for risk, and we need to consult with that provider of the activity, check if they've got proper control measures in place to manage the risk to the young person. Are their instructors qualified? Have they got good preventive strategies for harm? Have they good safety procedures, that sort of thing? There's a couple of cases in your notes that I encourage you to read about a school handing over their students to a swimming school in the UK, and one of the young people drowned, and it was found that the school could not just delegate their duty of care to that swimming school, that they hadn't done sufficient due diligence on checking on the standards and qualifications of the swimming school, and so the school was found negligent. There's another example there about a Jillaroo school in New South Wales as well. So when we do send our students to another event or provider of a service or an activity, we do need to take actions to make sure that the young people are going to be safe and well cared for. So these sections here will also help you to do question 14, which is a bit further on. It's a scenario of a situation where you're handing over some of your young people to a place called Camping Australia. So I encourage you to go on and do Unit 14 after we've done this little section. Question 14, I mean. So it means if our duty of care is non-delegable, we need to have good communication with the provider of the service. We need to be able to check their references, check their public liability, their qualifications, their safety procedures, any emergency procedures, what sort of training they've got and qualification and safe procedures for animals and equipment. All of this kind of thing we will need to do before we hand over our students to their care. And we need to also check that they've done a risk assessment. So they might say, oh yes, we've got a good risk assessment here, but was it carried out by competent people? You know, did those people have sufficient knowledge, skills and experience to do a good risk assessment on their event? They may be a current employee, but most people would like to see some kind of external health and safety professionals who've done their risk assessment, particularly if they're high-risk activities that the young people are going to be taking part in. So let's have a look now at another section called Student Supervision, and this is talking about all the ways that we can ensure young people's safety and have a high duty of care by effective monitoring of all students. So in our environment and our activities in the boarding house and at the school, we need to be able to monitor students so that their welfare is always our first consideration. And that is because we want to be able to see potential issues, anticipate them and avoid them. If we're not effectively monitoring young people, we may not be able to do that. We also need to be able to take prompt action if harm does occur. That means we need to be out there effectively monitoring and with the young people. So effective student supervision means we're moving around in the areas where the young people are, we're actively observing. Issues can be avoided and anticipated, and we can take prompt action. So we need to be out there watching over and guiding and not leaving them unsupervised. That means we're not sitting back in the office and just leaving the students to do what they want to do. Students need to know if we go out of the residence, how we can be contacted. If we go downtown on a shopping excursion or something, they need to know how to contact us if any harm comes their way. All right. Now, part of our understanding of how to care for students well is what sort of a ratio do we need to provide a good standard of care? Ratio of boarders to supervisors. Well, there's no regulation on this in Australia, in our industry, and that is because it depends a lot on the situation. So we just say that the ratio of boarders to supervisors needs to be enough to ensure satisfactory duty of care. So you need enough supervisors for the situation or the activity to provide a high standard of care. As I said, we've got boarding standards in Australia now, but they don't mandate what ratios of staff to students you should have, and we're not regulated in any way yet. But we believe that this will probably end up coming eventually. Now, that's because there's a lot of different factors that affect what is a good ratio for student care. And some of those things, you think about it, what might affect what number of staff you need per student. Of course, it's going to be what time of day it is. Are the students awake or asleep? What type of activity? What is the level of needs of your students? What is the level of independence of your students? So that's another factor that affects how many staff you need on, and also what's the experience and qualifications of the staff themselves. Now, in Australia, I said we don't have a regulated ratio, but there is an article that's around, and it's written by this Queensland Indigenous Education Consultative Council, and this is the only place where you might see a bit of a hint of what type of ratios we're talking about here. In this article, it actually says that the student house parent ratio for Indigenous students needs to be acknowledged as requiring to be about 8 to 10 to 1, so 8 students to 1 supervisor, rather than the 25 to 1 ratio on which most boarding schools operate. And that's because we need to recognise the high demand nature of the special care and intervention needed to really transition Indigenous students into boarding. There's often other factors involved, and so that's one place where you can find a little bit of a reference to a ratio, but in general you can't, not even in our boarding standards. What about our emergency procedures now? Let's have a look at how we need to work with emergency procedures. These are the correct response to a crisis, and we do need to know what our procedures are in our boarding houses. We may not know every part of every procedure, but the more perhaps the more serious ones, the more likely ones, for instance, medical emergencies like asthma, anaphylaxis, drug and alcohol overdoses, severe weather if you're in a cyclone area, drowning if you take students to the beach a lot or to pools. You do need to be aware of what's in your procedures. How do you manage these events? Every organisation must have emergency procedures and critical incident handbooks and policies. Some of these need to be on the walls in your residence, and we just cannot ever think that this will never happen to us. In recent times, students in Australia have been killed in these kinds of events. So there's a reference here where this person has done some research into outdoor education fatalities, where young people have been killed in Australia from 1960 to 2002, and that was all those events. So in Brooks's review, he said very few of these fatalities or these incidents were unpreventable. There was some factor of fatigue or stress maybe with the adults concerned. But in saying that, he also says that to prevent, deaths occurring, we don't have to wrap children in cotton wool or stop them from going into outdoor activities, but we do need to be aware and alert as staff and not tired, distracted, preoccupied. He also talks a fair bit about the impact of weather on a lot of these incidents, and so we do need to be aware of the possibility of weather events occurring and take precautions and be aware of the weather. Another situation where we need to be careful and have high standard of care is when we're transporting students. And there's three areas where we particularly need to be able to manage safety of young people in transport issues, and that's around ensuring that our vehicles are safe and that we have correct procedures and methods for maintaining our vehicles and ensuring that they are safe and roadworthy. Then the other part is the driver behaviour needs to be managed well, and also the student behaviour in the vehicles needs to be managed well. So there's three different areas of concern when we're transporting students. So there's some of the points that we would be looking at about managing driver behaviour, student behaviour, and our vehicle safety. You can also use those points there when you're again doing question number 14, the scenario about transporting some students to Camping Australia event. You might want to come back and refer to this page or this slide here for filling in that scenario. Now, what about illness and medical treatment? This is another whole subject, isn't it? A big topic that we can check our duty of care. And question 12 is asking, what are some of the important considerations when we have to administer medication to students? So usually we need to ensure that we have parental permission, and we've checked before we give any medication that we do have parental permission for that medication. That even refers to just things like Panadol and painkillers and cough medicine and things. We should always check that there's no allergies on the student's medical form and that we have got the parents' permission to give that medication. Then we also need to have all medications stored securely under lock and key so that young people don't be self-medicating or have access to them. The third thing is that we need to make sure that they are administered correctly. Now, we'll talk about this a bit more in the next slide or two, but there's some ways that we need to check that we're administering them correctly, and also we need to have a written record kept every time we administer any medication. So, before we give out the medication, I said earlier that we need to check for any allergies, for permissions, and that, when we take the students somewhere else and hand them over to another organisation, like in our scenario, we need to be able to advise and hand over medications to the new person who has the duty of care, and then also be ensured that they are going to keep the medications in a locked cabinet. They would also need to be able to check recent history, so we need to give the medications chart over when we are taking students to another organisation as well. What about when we're actually administering the medication? There's the 5 rights way of checking that you've got the right person, the right drug, the right dose, the time and the route. And a lot of residences now are making sure that as they give out the medication, they do that even in front of a CCTV camera, just so that the staff is still observing the student, but also we've got evidence on the camera. This is as a bit of a safeguard that some places are doing. Then after the medication's administered, we must document that we've administered it, sign it, date it, and also monitor the young person for a while after giving the medication. We shouldn't just let them be disappearing off immediately. Particularly prescription medication, we need to monitor them for a while. The other way that we can ensure safety for young people is knowing any student with a serious condition or known condition. We need to have an emergency management plan for them. So these plans must be up to date, must be visible, particularly for things like anaphylaxis, asthma, epilepsy, those kind of conditions. and all staff must know about them. So these are usually written in some form of chart in the staff room or somewhere visible for the staff, particularly when you hand over to a new person. There's samples here of some types of medication administration sign-off sheets. This one's from Queensland Education Department. And I can give you copies of those if you'd like to email us for them. So we're talking here about things like severe allergic reactions or anaphylaxis, conditions like that. We need to know our policy, and the residents must have a good training in these areas for staff. Now, what about high-risk activities? How do we handle high-risk activity? Do we can it all? Do we ban it all? Or do we just make sure that a risk assessment is correctly carried out before any high-risk activities are approved? So question 13 is saying, how does a risk assessment document actually help us? Well, a risk assessment is going to do these things. It's going to make us evaluate the risks of any activity. It's going to make us make plans to prevent any harm, avoid any harm occurring. So we will check our staff qualifications, our experience, and what ratio we need to cover the number of students and their experience and that sort of thing. It will also cause us, when we do our risk assessment, to check our policies. So you might need to know, what does the policy say about how many staff to students when I go swimming? Also makes us check that we take the right equipment needed. Do we need to take a flotation device if we're taking students swimming? Have we got our first aid kit on hand? Is it properly stocked? And then it also makes us check what kind of instructions we're going to give to students when we do this activity, and warnings and that sort of thing. We need to know exactly what students we've got, how many, and any with special needs like allergies and asthma. We need to have their emergency management plans, their EpiPens, those sorts of things with us when we go on the activity. And then, of course, a very good point about our risk assessment being done is that it gives us evidence that we've done proper planning and taken all the precautions possible. If something does go wrong and the boarding house ends up in court over a charge of negligence or a young person is harmed, this risk assessment is going to be important evidence in that court proceeding. It also shows that you just have a high standard of care. So it'll have a lot of this detail on it. So this brings us up to question 14 now. And as I mentioned before, we need to look at this scenario and check that we've done all the right kinds of, taken all the right precautions, we've got everything planned well for this scenario when we're taking 10 boarders to a place called Camping Australia where they're going to be staying on a leadership camp. We're driving them there and we've got some students who've got, medical conditions. So you need to fill in all the steps that you would take to manage the risk to students during travel, when they are referred to the other organisation called Camping Australia. Just how will we check, how will we ensure that they're going to be safe and manage any risk while they're on that camp for 10 days? And what about any medical situations? How will we manage the risk there? So if you go back through some of the points we've already covered in that area of travel, referral and medical, you should be able to complete this scenario. So travel points, referral points, medication points. There's a list here, but I'm not going to leave them up on the screen because you need to be able to work through those situations yourself. Being prepared for an emergency now is part 2. Let's have a look. Question 15 is asking us, what are 9 things that we should do to be prepared for crisis or emergency events? And most boarding houses nowadays have some sort of a safety or emergency folder like this one here in the photograph. That's the best one we've seen around from Tiwi College. So there's 9 points here of how we can be prepared for crisis events. The first one is that we need to know our emergency procedures. We need to know where to access them, have them on hand, and know any signals that go with those procedures, like fire evacuation signals, lockdown signals. We need to be well aware of those. Then we need to know our role and have a clear understanding of what is your role in the crisis. What will the emergency management team do, but what's your role if you're a first responder? Usually it's to care for the young people. It's not to try and put out the fire or to be the hero. It's to try and make sure that the young people are safe. That's usually our first role. We must know how to access the student role and be confident that it's current and accessible and available. So how to quickly get hold of that role when needed and not be relying on power, say in a fire and things like that. We need to know that that is current and available. We also need to know emergency numbers and how to find them, have them, and be sure that they're current and available, and also contact details of parents. So you imagine being in a situation that actually occurred in a boarding house in Western Australia a few years back, where the bus was travelling back from a sporting event, football game or something, and the head of boarding was driving the bus and he had a heart attack and crashed the bus. And so you've got the head of boarding on the bus injured, and students who are injured and dying, and you might get the call back at the boarding house being on duty, and what are you going to do? How are you going to manage to contact parents, contact emergency situations, and be in control of the whole situation? You also need to know that your emergency equipment is available and in good condition, like torches in the batteries, that sort of thing. And you also need to have had regular evacuation and lockdown drills in your boarding house. Now you might say, how often is regular? How often should this be done? Again, we don't have a standard on this in the boarding industry, but usually the standard is that you shouldn't be confident that all students have participated and know the drill and take it seriously, that all staff know the drill and take it seriously and have been participating in a drill of some sort. So if you get new students, you need to do it again. And so every time you do an evacuation or lockdown drill, these should be kept in a log in the residence, so that it's good evidence also that you've been keeping up to date and have prepared for these events. Any situations that do occur, you should have regular reviews after the process has been completed or after the events occurred. You should be able to go back and review the emergency procedure, or anytime you do a drill, you should review it and say, how well did it work? Any deficits, you should alert the management and make improvements and recommendations. Another way we can be prepared for crisis is to make sure our staff training is current. So all staff having first aid up to date, having trained fire wardens, this sort of thing. And the last one is, do we know our communication policy? Usually it should only ever be the principal, the head of boarding, the chair of the board, or the emergency management team that are allowed to comment to the media. Every staff member should know that they must not arm comment themselves or allow students to be commenting outside to the media or to other people until the all clear is given. So how do we make an emergency management plan for these kinds of crisis events? Well, emergency management plans are usually developed by an emergency team or by management working together to come up with it. So an emergency management plan should have preparation, prevention, response and recovery in it. So have the preparation done ahead of time for if this event might occur. Have prevention, how are we going to prevent these events from occurring? What do we do if it does occur? And then looking on it afterwards, how are we going to make sure that people are supported afterwards and can recover? So that means, your emergency team will develop that emergency management plan. They will also induct all new staff and ensure that the drills are carried out, manage the response and coordinate the recovery afterwards. Could be a bomb threat, evacuation, could be an armed intruder threat. This is fairly rare in Australia, fortunately, but we know of some boarding houses that have had to go into lockdown because of an armed intruder. So if you don't have a lockdown policy that you've drilled and practiced, then it's a good time to get started at making sure that you have one. So we'll go on now to keeping the premises safe. We need to know that our buildings and grounds are safe, and that means that our residents should be checking the premises and grounds regularly. And the first way is by all staff knowing that if they see a hazard, they have to identify it and record it and deal with it. So hazards are identified by all staff, no matter who they are. Also, we have regular inspections, like it might be the maintenance staff, the head of boarding or the checking team that might do it, and that might be done every term to inspect the premises and the grounds for safety. We should also have checks of specific safety areas by qualified professionals. That might mean your fire alarm system checked every term, with fire equipment, your extinguishers and that being checked on a regular basis, and usually you get outside professionals to do this. Having an annual safety audit of your buildings, grounds and equipment, and also checking your policies and procedures are all up to date and available. So these are the ways in which we ensure we have the safest possible premises and residents. These are some of the ways that your safety checks might, some of the areas your safety checks might cover. Be aware of tripping hazards, shelves and storage, things that might fall on people, furniture in good repair, that sort of thing. What about dangerous goods? How do we ensure that we are storing and keeping young people safe from harm from dangerous goods? Can you think of a type of dangerous goods that you have in your premises? Some people think, what about medication? But we're not talking about medication here. We're talking about chemicals, dangerous goods like maintenance goods, gas, even LPG gas storage, that sort of thing. So you have to think of one, and then you have to explain how it's safely handled and protected. Students are protected from harm. So good practice with dangerous goods and hazardous substances, it should be identified in a chemical register somewhere in your residence, where it's stored, usually safely stored, and in a locked cabinet. And then a risk assessment and control should be done on that dangerous goods. So you should have a safety information sheet, or what they call a material safety data sheet, MSDS, that is in the cabinet with the dangerous goods. people should be provided with training and personal protective equipment if they're using that good chemical or whatever it is. And then are there correct signs displayed about the harm and the cautions about that chemical. Going on to section 16 now, which is all about security for your premises. Thinking about your residence, what sort of security features do you have for your buildings? Do you have perimeter fencing? Is there movement sensor lighting inside or mostly outside or in the common areas that come on at night when everybody's in bed? Do you have security mesh on doors and windows? Do you have doors that are alarmed coming into student areas? Is there CCTV cameras about the place? And the other safety feature that some residence buildings have is actually having staff sleeping on the premises at night. So that's one of your security features. Have you got sleepover flats and that sort of thing? Now, another concern for student safety is access from the outside to the students. And we need to ensure that access to students' living areas is not permitted, even including parents, without correct supervision and being able to be sure that every person that has access to students is safe. And of course we can't do that. We can't ask them all, have you got a working with children's card or something? So that means that if any people are coming into the boarding residence that aren't authorised to be there, then we need to approach them and prevent them from having free access to student areas. The sleeping areas for students must be for the exclusive use of students and not for other adults for some reason or another. So how do we ensure that access is everyone's concern? Well, that means every staff member and also the students should be trained in this, that if you see a visitor that you're not sure who they are or why they're there on the premises, then everybody knows that they approach and ask them if it looks safe to do so. Of course, if there's any threat or alert from that person, if they look like they have a weapon or something looking dangerous or angry, then you wouldn't approach and ask. You would alert somebody immediately, either by alerting the head of boarding, or if they look dangerous enough, you might have to alert police. If they don't look harmful and you are able to approach and ask, then you need to ask them to come and sign in at the office. So all visitors should be asked to sign in. And then if the visitor doesn't have a working with children's card, but they need to go into a student's area for some reason, say they're a workman or a parent who needs to go and help the child pack their bag or collect their bag or something, then they must be accompanied at all times. Only people with working with children's clearance cards should be allowed to be in a student's area without supervision. And that means we also need to know about special access arrangements for some parents, like on the application form students may have that this parent or that parent are not allowed to access the student without permission from the other parent. So thinking now about question 21, this is another scenario where it's asking if you had a new boarding supervisor, Tony, just been employed, and you were asked to carry out the part of his induction that included emergency procedures and responding to different crisis events. Make some notes, make a summary list of all the topics that you think you would need to cover to ensure that Tony is prepared for possible crisis situations. So you need to think about what sorts of things you would cover with him. Now, you might not make a list of earthquake, fire and all that. You're more looking for the list of things like show him where the policies and procedures are, show him how to access them, show him the main ones like the fire evacuation policy, the lockdown policy, the anaphylaxis policy or the suicide policy. Show him these really significant main ones, get him to read them through. I would even be getting him to sign off that he's seen all the different policies and read them. We need to also make sure that he understands what his role would be in a crisis. So that means maybe addressing, showing him where the first aid kits are, where the fire extinguishers are, where to access the student roll, if we have to evacuate, how to access the alarms and that sort of thing, the alarm panels, what he does when the alarms go off. Also, we need to show him how to access emergency numbers, student parent numbers. We might also want to check, does he have his qualifications for like first aid qualifications up to date and that sort of thing. So I think that should help you think through scenario number 2, which is question 21. And some of the things like even visitor policy, ensure that you tell Tony that it's everybody's responsibility and what he should do if he sees an unknown person on the property. So those are some of the things that you would need to cover in this scenario. All right. What about how do we work with any bullying or physical abuse that might occur in the boarding house? Our main role, of course, is to be continually vigilant and to be alert and aware and in touch with the young people, because we can't just allow bullying or physical abuse to occur. It might be physical, but it might also be online bullying. So sometimes you have to think, is every little thing that happens to a student that upsets them a little bit, is it always bullying, or can it just be something that they are learning through socialising with other students? What is cyberbullying and how do we handle it? Any harassment through technology is called cyberbullying or online bullying, and this does affect a lot of young people in Australia. It's over 10% of all Aussie kids have been affected by this. So we need to know how to handle it and how to prevent it from occurring. So what would be the adult response to this kind of bullying? Well, if a young person tells you about it, you need to not overreact or punish them, but give them some empathy. That means to say, yes, that would be painful, that I can see that you're very upset. Reassure them, we can deal with this, we can work together and sort this through. We're not going to disconnect you, but we need to help you have some strategies to know how to handle this. So one of the first strategies, of course, is that we need you to keep the evidence, so that if we do need to show it to head of boarding or if parents ring and ask about it, we've got the evidence there. We need to then work with the young person to know how to handle it, and we need to encourage them to never respond. It will just make it worse, but to know how to block the person doing it, delete and remove it off their site and report it to the appropriate authority if necessary. Fortunately, they've told you. If you know about it, then they've told somebody that they can trust, and to know that it can be a criminal offence and we may have to tell the police if necessary. So that's talking about question 22, but a bit further down then there's a scenario about this. So I'll just show you in scenario number 3 is question 25, and you're going to need to work through how to support a student who's been bullied online and how to work with the other two students and the bystanders who've been doing the bullying. So I'll just alert you to question 25 as well. Now, what about night supervision? How are we ensuring that young people are safe at night in our residences? They need to know and feel completely secure. So some of the options for night supervision are having sleepover staff in the residence, having flats where staff can sleep over, or accommodation on site, or at least having staff on call. Some residences have staff flats, but they're not actually inside the students' area. They're in the nearby areas, and the staff have some sort of call arrangement. Or some residences even have active night duty, and the active night duty person actually does bed checks. So there are some remote boarding residences where this is occurring. Do we have door alarms on our accommodation, or are there locks? Do we have fences and locked gates around the premises or not? These are some security features. There are a few, not many, residences in Australia where there's actually security staff on patrol at the gate. So awake security staff on patrol all night long. And then, of course, CCTV is another feature of your security for nighttime supervision. We need to talk now about how we handle a missing student situation. And I want to encourage you to be aware that it's very important that if a student does go missing, that we begin to keep records of the times and the actions that we take straight away. So many residences are using a record like this to keep a record of all the actions that you do, because if you've got one of these AWOL student tracking report forms, it gives you evidence of all the steps you've taken. You can hand over to the next person when you go off duty and they know what you've done. So the next person on roster is well informed. If the police have to be called in, they can be well informed about all the things you've done to check for this young person. And this should then be kept in a log of critical incidents. So your procedure might look something like this. Maybe you do a bit of asking around first. If you think a student's missing, you might check with their friends, other students, other staff. And of course, you need to also think about the student's risk level. Are they a high-risk student? Have they done this before? Do they have some medical conditions and things which make them more at risk? You might quickly need to be able to check the sign-out list as well. And somewhere here on these first two steps, you need to start documenting all these steps. So as soon as you start asking around because you think somebody's missing, make a note of that time when that first started. Check your sign-out list, search. Some people would do a bit of a search of the student's bedroom, of the common areas, of the immediate grounds, just in case the student is outside. You may try phoning the student or texting them, or asking a friend to phone or text them. But then if you still haven't found the student after these steps have been taken, it might be time to notify the head of boarding, and head of boarding may end up contacting parents and talking to them, or known places where the student sometimes gets signed out to in the area. And then, of course, the police might have to become involved. Eventually, when the student is found and the process is completed, you would need to finish all your documentation and store these in some sort of a log of incidents. So your residents might have a different procedure. Please put it in how you do it. Some say after this amount of time you must contact the head of porting or you must contact the police. I'm sorry it's been such a long PowerPoint for you, but I hope you've been able to follow all those situations in your BF3. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.